Hello, fellow bookworms, and welcome back to the Abyss Book Club. I'm Brittany.
And I'm Hallie.
And we're really excited to have you back with us. This is definitely an episode we've been looking forward to for a long time. This is going to be a really good one. So we hope that you enjoy this sort of different episode. For this one, it's not as important that you've read the entire book. So if you haven't and you still just think it's an interesting topic, just stay tuned. We'll be going over a lot of what happened in the book and our thoughts about it and different things like that.
If you didn't read the book, this was a non-fiction book, so we're going to be discussing it as if it's a case, but we just want to make sure that you're aware we are only referencing the book. It's not like one of our normal episodes where we did a bunch of research on the case in general. We're just going to be referencing this book by Philip Carlo.
So stay tuned. Make sure to subscribe on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on, and follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter so you can always keep up to date with our new episodes and what our next books are going to be and things like that. Make sure you stay tuned for the end of the episode to find out what our next book is going to be. And let's jump into the abyss. So today we're discussing The Iceman, Confessions of a Mafia Contract Killer by Philip Carlo. And the summary for that from Amazon is: Richard Kuklinski was Sammy the Bull Gravano's partner in the killing of Paul Castellano, then head of the Gambino crime family at Sparks Steakhouse. Mob boss John Gotti hired him to torture and kill the neighbor who accidentally ran over his child. For an additional price, Kuklinski would make his victims suffer. He conducted this sadistic business with cold-hearted intensity and shocking efficiency, never disappointing his customers. By his own estimate, he killed over 200 men, taking enormous pride in his variety and ferocity of technique. This trail of murder lasted over 30 years and took Kuklinski all over America and to the far corners of the earth, Brazil, Africa, and Europe. Along the way, he married, had 3 children, and put them through Catholic school. His daughter's medical condition meant regular stays in the children's hospital, where Kuklinski was remembered, not as a gangster, but as an affectionate father, extremely kind to children. Each Christmas found the Kuklinski home festooned in colorful lights. Each summer was a succession of block parties. His family never suspected a thing.
So a little bit of background on Philip Carlo himself. He was an American journalist. He grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and he himself had gotten into organized crime. He had seen a friend get shot and killed by a hitman once, and he even got into a gang fight and was shot in the forehead at the age of 16. So he had a really rough adolescence. And this life-threatening injury really made him change his ways. He started getting into more writing, and he wrote a lot of different true crime books. When he was getting into his writing and becoming more and more passionate about it, it kind of took him away from the world of crime, and he exemplified crime instead in writing. Being a part of that environment and the organized crime world really made him get a better perspective on everything and gave him the opportunity to write amazing novels with real sources that he experienced. Unfortunately, Philip Carlo was also suffering from Lou Gehrig's disease, and he ended up dying in 2010 at the age of 61.
So getting into the book, it starts with Richard Kuklinski's history. He was born in Jersey City, New Jersey. His dad, Stanley, was a Polish immigrant, and his mother, Anna, was from Dublin. His mother had a really rough time growing up. She grew up in an orphanage because her mother was run over and her father died of pneumonia. At this orphanage, she was raped by a priest and beaten by nuns. Later, she met Stanley Kuklinski, and they were married. But Stanley was a pretty awful person. He constantly accused her of being a tramp since she wasn't a virgin. She couldn't really tell him that she had been raped. So he lashed out at her. He would beat her. He accused her of infidelity. But even so, they created a family and had a son together named Florian. And Stanley would beat Florian really badly as well. Later, they had Richard, and he too received a lot of aggression. Unfortunately, these beatings got so bad that one day Stanley repeatedly hit Florian in the back of the head, and he fell down and never got back up. Everyone in the family was forced to say that Florian fell down the stairs rather than being beaten. So that was hard for the family to lie about, and it really messed Richard up for pretty much his whole life. Richard was bullied throughout school for wearing tattered clothes and for being tall, for being Polish, pretty much for anything that kids could pick on about. This really made him develop a long-lasting inferiority complex, which is compensating for feelings of inferiority by behaving in ways that make them seem superior. He started killing stray animals, pretty much wiping out the neighborhood of stray cats and things like that. He had trouble reading because he had dyslexia really bad, but he loved true crime magazines and started getting them whenever he could, and he would go sit and read them for hours. He was really amazed at the process of solving crime and learned a lot about criminal behavior and police techniques and things like that, and it was really interesting to him. So that sort of, I think, got the ball rolling a little bit in his head.
Some ideas.
One kid in particular, Charlie, bullied him a lot, and one day when Richard was 13 years old, he waited for Charlie and ended up beating him to death. He didn't exactly mean to initially. He just was, I think, over all the bullying and wanted to sort of take revenge. But once he realized that Charlie was dead, he kind of put that true crime knowledge into use and removed his teeth and fingertips to prevent ID and threw the body over a bridge. In another incident, Richard killed a man named Doyle. He was asleep in his car, and Richard went and poured gasoline all over the car inside and just lit the match and watched him burn to death. So he had a pretty brutal upbringing and was pretty young when he started.
With these two murders in Richard's repertoire, he ended up getting into organized crime. He joined a group called the Coming Up Roses. It was this small gang that he put together for criminal activities. They started helping out people like Carmen Genovese with hits and robberies. Richard even went to the extent of killing his own friends if necessary. He was kind of like a lone wolf, so he felt that if he needed to cut ties, he could do that. Eventually, cutting all of these ties, he started working alone. He was able to get away with a ton of crimes and was extremely strong for his lanky size. So when he was asked if he exercised any when he was a young man, he replied, quote, "The only exercise I ever got was carrying dead bodies," end quote. Richard also didn't really trust drug dealers. He considered them very unreliable, and he also didn't really like people who hurt children and women. He refused to ever fulfill a hit that hurt a woman or a child. Eventually, he was hired by the De Cavalcantes, and he realized that he needed to get better at fulfilling hits and killing people, and he also enjoyed it in a way. So he started traveling from New York to Jersey City to kill people for sport. He primarily focused on homeless people or drug addicts, and the police could never find a witness or clues to who did it, so eventually they just ended up thinking that homeless people were just taking each other out, and there was no single perpetrator behind it. Eventually, Richard ended up knocking up a woman named Linda, and so he decided to marry her. Their marriage was very toxic. He would beat her often, which is kind of ironic because he hated people who hurt women and children, but yet he would beat his wife. And he didn't really love Linda. He knew that. And one day he found out that Linda was cheating on him because he walked in on her with another man. Richard was livid. He ended up breaking many of the bones in the man's body. And he also cut off both of Linda's nipples as punishment. So he got very violent, very physical, and he was very abusive. After that, Linda and Richard barely spoke or even saw each other, and Richard barely got access to the sons that he had had with her as well. Eventually, they started planning for a divorce.
In 1961, Richard met Barbara Pedrici. And at this point, he was 26 years old and had killed over 65 people. He met her through work and actually got fired for talking to her because their boss didn't want Richard to talk to her. And she felt kind of bad for him, so she agreed to go on a date with him. And Richard pretty much immediately fell in love with her. I don't know if you can call it love, but he became kind of obsessed with her. And decided that he wanted her to be his wife, and that was it. They went on a few dates, and Barbara said, quote, "Worst mistake I ever made. I should have run for the hills, but instead I walked outside like a lamb to slaughter," end quote. Soon after they started dating, Richard went to Barbara's home for Christmas, and he was really fascinated by her family's love for Christmas and the holiday season, their togetherness and all of that, because he had never had that growing up. So he was kind of in awe of all of that when he saw it. He saw this caring and loving family, and he really wanted to be a part of that and kind of feel involved in that kind of thing. And he felt really loved that everyone had gifts, everyone was laughing together and eating, and he just felt really at home there. He knew he wanted to marry her and was so intent on that. He started showing up everywhere she went, became super controlling, and Barbara was very strong and very independent even then, and she noticed his controlling behavior and she was really uncomfortable. She even tried to break up with him, but he stabbed her in the shoulder and threatened to kill pretty much her whole family if she ever left him. So she decided to stay with him. Richard would be super kind, buying her flowers and gifts and showering her in affection one minute, and then he would flip out, break things, and threaten her and beat her. So that's classic love bombing. Barbara said, quote, "When he was the good Richard, he couldn't have been nicer, more giving and considerate. When he was the bad Richard, he was the meanest bastard on the face of the earth," end quote. Richard kept pushing, and eventually they started sleeping together and Barbara became pregnant. Richard was super happy because he thought this was kind of his shoe-in to marry her, but Barbara became even more scared. Instead of staying with Richard, she decided to flee to Miami to stay with her father. She didn't want to have an abortion. She wanted to have the baby. She just didn't want Richard involved in her life at all. Unfortunately, her mother was in contact with Richard, and her main problem with him was that he wasn't divorced yet. So when he told her that he would definitely get a divorce if he just had the money, Barbara's mother decided to not only give him the money to divorce Linda, but also she told Richard where Barbara was. So Richard went and got Barbara, which is just like one of those awful things. Like if that one thing hadn't happened, Barbara's life could have been so different.
Dramatically different.
So it's like, I can't imagine a mother directing her daughter's abuser straight towards her.
Clearly, her mother wasn't taking into consideration how Barbara felt, because if Barbara was fleeing to Florida, obviously there's a problem.
Yeah, and not even contacting her and being like, "Do you want to talk to him?" Or like, what's going on with this? Just being like, "Yeah, go get her." That's just awful. But Richard found her and forced her to return with him, and they got married. Once, while Barbara was still pregnant, Richard saw her smoking, and that enraged him. So he beat her so badly that he fractured her big toe, and he made her sit on a gray metal stool on the porch all night, saying that he would kill her if she moved a muscle. And she was scared. Again, she definitely knew that he was capable of violence, so she knew that his threats were pretty valid, and she stayed there all night. And unfortunately, the next day she lost the baby. This was sort of a reoccurring thing that would happen. Barbara became pregnant again. She had miscarried. She had at least 4, if not more, miscarriages over their relationship. And each of these was caused by Richard beating her or abusing her in some way, which again, you think back to him being so incensed by abuse of children and women, and he's basically killing his unborn children and hurting his wife, just treating her like property instead of a human being. Richard commented on his anger. He said, quote, "When I get mad, I just see red and go off like a bomb. I didn't like that about myself. Still don't. I didn't want to hurt Barbara. I loved Barbara. Problem was, I guess, I was obsessed with her. After I struck her or became abusive, I was always mad at myself. Real mad. I'd look in the mirror and I really didn't like what I saw." End quote. So Richard was aware that what he was doing was wrong, and even though he treated her like property, he still, I think, understood on some level that he wasn't treating her well and that he didn't like that about himself. So there again, I think you kind of see these like moments of humanity or morals or something kind of peek through, but it wasn't enough to overshadow the bad parts of him.
I think that's one thing about the Richard Kuklinski case that interests me the most is his psychology is so insane. It's like you think he's a sociopath, but yet he has his own moral compass. It's very unique and different. And when you think about like abnormal psychology, he's a very special case. And we'll get more into different stuff later that just shows you even more about his moral compass, but also about his sociopathic tendencies. It's very strange.
So Barbara became pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to their daughter Merrick. And Merrick had a lot of medical problems. Richard would stay with her in the hospital and loved spending time with her. He really enjoyed his time in the children's hospital too, because he could help a lot of children, make them smile. He would buy gifts and toys and balloons for the kids, and he would help kids that couldn't afford things. Like, I know there was one instance where one of the children was terminal and the family couldn't afford for a TV to be in the room, so he paid for that. So he really liked being with Merrick, and he really liked seeing the other children smile and had a good time with that. Barbara gave birth to another daughter, Kristen. This was her 5th pregnancy, and later she gave birth to a boy, Dwayne. And Richard was very envious of the attention that Dwayne received from Barbara. He didn't feel this way about his daughters, but any kind of male attention towards Barbara, even his own son, he really didn't like. So that's kind of an interesting thing as well. It's sort of like a reverse Freud kind of situation.
Yeah, and a reverse like Oedipus complex.
So Richard didn't really connect or even like Dwayne that much, but he never beat him. He just sort of was a little bit more cold to him. And Barbara was always very proud of Dwayne and tried to kind of pump up his accomplishments and stuff, but Richard just never really connected with him like he did with his daughters, and Merrick in particular. He was very close to Merrick.
Richard was also continuously helping out his younger brother, Joseph. Joseph was always getting into trouble. One day, Joseph Kuklinski, he was 25 at the time, he was drunk and he took a 12-year-old girl named Pamela Dial to the roof of a building with her dog. He tried to have sex with her, and when she refused, he just sodomized her and then choked her to death. Joseph Kuklinski then threw her lifeless body off of the roof. With Lady, Pamela's dog, still barking, he caught the dog and threw the dog off the roof as well. Lady ended up having several broken ribs and a broken leg, but she wasn't dead. She was able to crawl next to Pamela and just howled and howled and howled. And people started complaining about the noise and decided to call the police. And when police came to check out what was the noise coming from, they found Pamela's body. Richard went to meet his brother at jail. Joseph kind of expected Richard to just come bail him out because he had always gotten him out of trouble. But as we've talked about, Richard didn't really like it when people hurt women or children. So Richard asked him, why did he do it? And Joseph replied, quote, because she wanted it, end quote. Richard was livid at this response, and he thought about his daughters having to go through such a thing, and he was just done. He walked out that day and left his brother there in prison and never helped him and never talked to him again. Money started to become a problem in the Kuklinski family. Richard started getting very overwhelmed. He knew he had to make more money to support his family and to pay the medical bills that Merrick had gotten. So he was working continuously. He ended up getting into the porn industry and started making pretty good money. Slowly, this led to him being more involved with organized crime, and he was able to make thousands off of this porn industry that he started. He also met a man named Roy DeMeo. If you read the book, you know Roy was a pretty big person in Richard Kuklinski's life and organized crime. And they formed this group with some other guys where they conducted organized crime business. While working for this business, Richard would occasionally run into other hitmen, which we thought this was just so crazy to us that one of the men were disguising themselves as an ice cream truck driver. I think a Mr. Softy driver.
Yeah.
And it just made me realize that I will never trust an ice cream driver again. I was so shocked.
There were a few things from this book that really stuck with me that I think about like all the time, and that's definitely one of them. Anytime I hear an ice cream truck, I'm like, oh no.
Me too. I read this book before Brittany did, and I remember sitting in one of our Airbnbs while we were traveling, and Brittany was away at the moment, so I was by myself, and all I heard outside of the neighborhood was this ice cream truck music, and I was like, oh no, I'm gonna die. But yeah, it's definitely been engraved in my mind now. Richard also learned about using cyanide as a means to kill someone without leaving any detectable traces in the blood. Obviously, I think nowadays with our advanced technology, it probably doesn't work the same. I'm not quite sure about toxicology like that. But at the time, it would appear on the autopsy reports that it was just a heart attack. He would do this by spraying it in their face, dropping it in their drinks. He would even inject them with a syringe. So he had all different methods of poisoning these individuals. There was one part in the book that also was engraved in our minds. I think every time we watch like little videos of Richard or even just like reading about the book or talking about it now, it's funny to just think of him as this serious guy. And one time in a bar, he was poisoning someone, and it was at a gay bar, and so he dressed up in full attire to match the gay community, and I think he said he was in pumps or something, so he was like super tall.
Yeah, colorful suit, the whole thing.
Yeah, and he ended up killing the guy that he needed to kill, and then he just left.
Just the image of him. He said he kind of like shimmied up to the guy and was like kind of dancing to blend in on the dance floor, and just that image of this huge, very serious guy just like
I don't know why.
Shimmying up to his victim.
I always picture him in a pink afro. I have no idea why. Did he say that?
I don't think so, but I agree.
A pink afro in like one of those, who's that guy, Jimmy? Or what's his name, where he wears those like skin tight sequensy suits and dances.
Oh yeah.
That guy. I always imagine him in like one of those with like a pink afro and some pumps on.
Yeah, just like sashaying up to this guy and then like spraying him and then just like fading into the crowd and like he's gone. That image just has stuck with me.
So during his time in organized crime, he also started gambling a lot. All of that money he was getting from the porn industry, he decided to see if he could make it into more money. He sometimes lost a lot of money, but other times he would bring a ton home. As for his murderous sprees, he worked as a freelance hitman for many of the mafia families. He was Polish, so it didn't really matter if he jumped around between different families. He couldn't be inducted into the families at the time, so he just ended up working for multiples. This included the Gambinos, the Pontes, De Cavalcantes, Lucchese, Colombo, Genovese, Bonanno. He even knew John Gotti and Sammy the Bull Gravano, so he was really going around the block. He knew all the big boys in town, and he was doing a bunch of hits for these people. He said that his key to getting all of these jobs done were to not ask too many details and to just get it done, plain and simple. If he asked too many details, it was, I guess, too much of a connection.
Yeah, he didn't really care what the person had done, why the hit was out. He just thought of it just like, somebody going to work any other day. Just do the job and get it done, get the money.
Kuklinski also started keeping notes on how to torture and kill people. He kept them in this like little spiral notebook, and he would get ideas from TV a lot, especially cartoons like Roadrunner and Popeye, and he would do some crazy stuff to people. He wouldn't just go up and shoot them with a gun. He would sometimes, but on other times, these mafia members would want someone to suffer. Rather, it was because they raped somebody, they stole from them, they wanted them to learn a lesson, and so they would want them tortured, not just killed flat out.
Richard was pretty good at hiding all of this from his family. Barbara didn't really ask too many questions. She kind of didn't want to know and pretty much liked it when he was out of the house, so as long as he was gone, she didn't really care. She did mention finding a gun wrapped up in a rag one time on a high shelf, but she just kind of put it back and never mentioned it. She was always afraid of what Richard's reaction would be to her questioning him or anything like that, so she just sort of tried to make the best of her situation. Richard had a huge collection of weapons. He had knives, pistols, silencers, garrotes, various poisons, spiked clubs, hand grenades, a crossbow, ice picks, rope, wire, explosives, plastic bags, pretty much you name it, he had it. The book describes a lot of these super gruesome attacks. There was one instance where he ended up hanging a man and used himself as the quote-unquote tree. He would stab people in the eyes or ears with ice picks. He would...
Oh, that makes me hurt.
Yeah.
Can you just imagine someone stabbing you in the ear?
Oof.
Ouch.
There was one that kind of stands out, I think, to probably most people that read the book, where this man had raped one of the mafia members' daughters, and they had Richard kill him, and they wanted him to really suffer. And Richard had gotten this idea from going fishing with people previously and them chumming the water and kind of seeing how the sharks reacted to that. So he took this man and mutilated him, basically removed his genitalia. He sliced open this man's abdomen and poured salt all over it just to make it that much worse. The man was still alive, and he actually put a life vest on him and then threw him in the ocean so the sharks would eat him instead of him drowning. So that's just so gruesome. The book starts explaining how he used rats to kill people and would record it if someone really wanted them to suffer, and then he'd have this recording to show them as proof. So just extremely graphic and brutal stuff. And he just didn't really feel any way about it. It was just a job to him. There were times that he would pour hot water up people's noses, or like I said, the rats. He did that multiple times because it was such an effective way, and the rats would pretty much eat the entire person. Like, you'd go back and there'd be nothing left. So it was a way for him to dispose of the body and have this torture element and all this stuff. So it was kind of like
what they say about pigs, where you can like throw a body into a pig pen or something.
Yeah, and they'll just finish it off completely. And he would take that video and get paid. I think there were a few times, I know in the book, that even the people that ordered the hit couldn't watch the video because it was just like too much for them. So that's pretty brutal. Richard was super smart and really kind of saw killing people as a science. So he always wanted to get better and try different things and experiment with things. And he found out that if you freeze a body, then it would make it more difficult for coroners to get an accurate time of death. So sometimes he would freeze the bodies and then put them out, and it would seem like they had died much later than they actually had. Supposedly, he also had a hit out for Jimmy Hoffa, and according to Richard, Jimmy Hoffa's body was smashed up in a car when they do the compact to like make it to a cube so they can melt it down, and shipped off to Japan. That's a huge mystery, I know, that has been open for a long time. So if that's true, that's pretty crazy. He also mentioned killing other organized crime figures like Paul Castellano and Carmine Galante. He also shot another man, Louis Masque, on the toilet in Phil Salamini's shop. Phil Salamini had a big mouth and told other people. Louis Masque becomes a pretty important character in the story, so we'll mention more about him later. Eventually, Richard started traveling internationally and had a bunch of schemes to make money. He would go to Europe, Brazil. I think he went to Africa one time, and very much did not enjoy it. And it's crazy because just when you think in the book that he just can't get any worse and that he's just this horrible, heartless person, he'll kind of turn around and do something that was good, like just a good thing.
And it just surprises you. You're like, what? He did that?
Yeah, because you would think that he's just unfeeling or like just didn't care and would just, see injustice or whatever and just walk away. But there were certain things that just really incensed him and he couldn't get past, and hurting children was one of those things. There was one time that he went to a house backing someone up for a deal. This person, kind of in a bragging way, asked Richard if he wanted to see some, he's called them toys, and he took him to the basement, and Richard saw about a dozen boys and girls from the age of about 7 to 14 that this man had been keeping, and Richard was absolutely infuriated. It just stuck with him. He said, quote, "I couldn't get the sight of those little kids out of my head. It was eating at me. I had to do something. I couldn't stop thinking about them," end quote. He wanted to kill the men right there and rescue these kids, but he knew that he had to kind of take a step back and think about what he was going to do and make sure that it was the right time and everything.
I'm sure at that moment too, he probably didn't have the upper hand, you know, because they were doing a deal. So there's probably a ton of people around.
Yeah. But later, Richard decided to act. He went to the house at night and killed everyone in the house that was holding these kids hostage. He called down to the basement and he asked the kids if anyone could count. And one of the little girls said that she could. And he told them to count, and that once she was done counting, to come out of the basement. He told them where the phone was and told them to call the police, and the police would come and get them, that they were safe now and they couldn't be hurt anymore. So he saved all those kids, and he didn't have to do that. It didn't have anything to do with his business. It was just something he did because he hated to see children abused like that.
With all of the extracurricular activities that were occupying Richard's time, his abuse still never went away from his family. He would break his kids' toys. He tore cabinets off of the wall. He was raping Barbara. He considered her more his property than her being a companion to him or even a human being.
And that's one interesting thing too. He hated rapists so much that he would basically, I know the man that he threw to the sharks, he told him that he would have done it for free, that he just hated rapists that much. But then he was one, but in his head it wasn't the same thing.
Yeah, it was like he owned her, so how could you rape her if you own her? But as we know, like, rape is rape, you know?
Yeah, so he kind of compartmentalized things in his head, and he had his kind of moral code, but he would do those things. It just didn't connect for him.
One time, Richard even ripped out the kitchen sink and threw it through the window. There was another time that they got this thick Italian marble table, and it took 4 men to carry it into the house. But one night when Richard got mad and his adrenaline kicked in, he ended up picking up the table all by himself and chucking it through the window. So if that doesn't tell you the strength of this man, I don't know what does. He would hit Barbara a lot in front of the children. Barbara threatened Richard, though, saying that she would personally kill him if he ever laid a hand on their children. And he later states that he believed her, and so he never did. Barbara wasn't shy, and she wasn't quiet. She would stand up for herself and stand up to Richard. A lot of times their children would have preferred for them to stay quiet because it just caused him to get more angry when she got riled up as well. But she never would. She refused to be a doormat and to be walked all over. She knew she was stuck in this marriage and she wasn't going to go down without a fight. Richard recalled telling Merrick one night, who was their oldest daughter, that, quote, "If mommy dies, you know I have to kill you and your sister. I couldn't leave any witnesses, you understand?" End quote. To which Merrick replied, quote, "Yes, daddy," end quote. That is just so awful to think about your dad killing you and just telling you, like, flat out, if your mom dies, like, you got to go too.
And there again, he mentioned it as though this was kind of a kindness that he was giving her, to tell her that, like, kind of, it's nothing personal, I just can't have witnesses. And he thought that was a good thing to tell her, that was like a comforting thing, but it was the opposite.
Yeah, he even told her that she would be the hardest to kill. Like, it was supposed to be reassuring.
He just didn't have the same, I don't know, level of humanity that as everyone else. So he thought he was doing something kind there, or I don't know, kind, but good. But really it was just a horrifying thing to hear your dad say.
Yeah, I'm sure it was traumatic as well. And he would later state that he loved Barbara so much that if he killed her, the only way he would be able to cope is if he killed his children as well, which doesn't make sense to me. That's another reason that his psychology is just so interesting, to try to understand what he was really thinking. Dwayne was very concerned about his safety and his family's safety, and he started preparing himself against his father. He ended up leaving guns and knives that were gifted to him by Richard in strategic places around his room so he could just grab them if he needed them. Richard also gave him a BB gun one time, so he practiced that way he could blind his father if he ever needed to. Richard also bought Dwayne a bow and arrow, which Dwayne practiced with as well, so he could add it to his prepared defense. So, you know, these children were really scarred if he's having to set up basically traps in his room to have weapons on hand. Kristen also became very sexually active at a young age just to get back at her father. She felt that she didn't have any control of things at home, and her only way to have control of herself and to get back at her dad was to be sexually active. He never found out, and he actually thought that Merrick, who was very well behaved, was the one who might be sleeping around. So Richard would actually follow Merrick to parties and to school, and he would hide in the bushes and just watch her to see how she was behaving. But little did he know that Kristen was actually the one that was being a lot more rambunctious than Merrick.
Richard was really good at flying under the radar and using all these different methods of killing people and all of that. So it was hard for police to connect him to a lot of crimes. But eventually the police did catch wind of Richard Kuklinski. He trusted the wrong people, or kind of became soft and kind of less worried about, or less paranoid about what was going on around him and things like that. He had one hit where he killed a man named Peter Calabro, and this actually was a police officer, which he didn't know. This hit was placed by Sammy Gravano, and Gravano didn't tell Richard that Calabro was a cop. So even though later he said he still would have done it, that would have been information that would have helped him kind of understand the danger he was in, I guess.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I remember reading too that even after Sammy was like paying him for doing the hit, he still didn't tell him it was an officer. I think he found out by the news or something like that.
Yeah, so I'm sure that was kind of a shock, because he knew that killing a police officer was going to bring a lot of heat down on him. So even though he said he would have still done it, he would have had that information. As we mentioned earlier, Richard would freeze some of the bodies, so the coroner would have a hard time with time of death. But eventually the coroner actually found ice crystals still in the bodies, and police got suspicious that these bodies were being frozen. So the jig was kind of up with that. And that's actually how Kuklinski got his nickname, the Iceman. There was one detective, Pat Kane, who jumped on the case and really, I think, showed dedication that we don't often see with any case, honestly, but especially cases that are this big.
The way he dedicated himself to this case reminds me of something from like Criminal Minds or NCIS.
Honestly, it was that level, and he was getting opposition from his coworkers. People were making fun of him. Everyone was like, oh no, that couldn't possibly be, you know, all these people were killed different ways and you're just crazy, and like trying to make something out of nothing. But he really felt strongly about it and really pushed forward to get this guy. He became kind of obsessed with it, even at the cost of some of his well-being and his family life and things like that. So he felt so strongly about this that he needed to move forward and basically pin Kuklinski. Initially, police only knew Richard Kuklinski as Big Rich. He was sort of a whisper here and there with their informants, but they didn't really get a good picture on who he was until Kuklinski actually killed two people that he worked with other crimes. One man, Danny Deppner, Richard killed with cyanide in his hamburger. And the other man, Gary Malaban, was killed via strangulation. Kuklinski killed both of these men because they were indicted, and he knew that they would basically squeal once the police put pressure on them. So he just got them out of the way. And Danny Deppner's wife actually went to the police and basically put a name to it. She named Richard Kuklinski and told police that he had killed a bunch of people and that she was scared, and that kind of finally put a real person to this murderer that they had been chasing but hadn't really been able to place. Pat Kane was able to connect Louis Masquet to Kuklinski via phone records leading up to the day of his disappearance. This was bad for Richard because he had previously denied even knowing Masquet, who, if you remember, is the one that he shot while he was on the toilet. So police created this elaborate setup for Kuklinski. They had an undercover cop, Dom Polifrone, and his job was basically to get close to Rich so he would incriminate himself. Polifrone was working with Solimene to create a backstory, kind of. Solimene said that he had known Dom for years and vouched for him, and Dom had to play cards. He had to really integrate himself into this life
Also, starting at this point in the book, there was also an episode I saw the other day of Deep Undercover on Netflix, and it had a full episode dedicated to this Dom guy who was trying to help catch Richard Kuklinski, and he went deep undercover to do it. So if you wanted to like see more about his perspective and stuff, you should definitely go watch the episode on Netflix called Deep Undercover.
And over time, they kind of put Dom out there as this guy who could get anything, get any kind of weapons or poison or anything. So that's how they got him close to Richard. He needed some cyanide. He actually needed cyanide because he wanted to kill Pat Kane, because he thought if he killed Pat Kane that all of his problems would be over. So he was actually basically soliciting the police to buy poison so he could kill an officer. Richard later said, quote, "Most all my life I had no friends. Phil was probably the only guy I considered a friend. I liked him. Barbara liked him too. I had no idea about the low-life backstabber he was," end quote. So there again, he never associated himself with anybody else. He didn't like working with other people for murder and the more gruesome crimes. So sort of being soft on that really ended up biting him.
Not to mention that Richard didn't bring work home. Like, he just didn't like anybody to know where he lived or who his family was, because he wanted to keep them safe from his organized crime life. So the fact that Phil knew Barbara and had been to their home just showed how much he trusts Phil.
So police tried to follow Richard initially, but realized pretty quick that that wasn't going to work at all, because Richard was an expert at not being followed. He could shake any kind of tail. He would drive around for hours. He would sit in one place for a while to make sure no one was nearby. He would drive around in circles, and it was pretty clear that they couldn't tail him, which actually ended up being kind of interesting because he had these deals in Europe and other places. So he would kind of leave town for like a week at a time or whatever, and the police just wouldn't know where he was at all because they hadn't followed him. And it wasn't like now where everything's tracked so intricately. So he would just disappear and they'd be like, where is he? We have no idea.
Then all of a sudden he pops back up and they're like, whoa, he's back.
So eventually, after a lot of time, Dom was able to kind of gain the trust of Richard, and Richard basically was just using him because he really needed cyanide because he wanted to kill Pat Kane. So he actually was planning to kill Dom as well after he got the cyanide. He started kind of getting suspicious that Dom was a flake, but never suspicious that he was a cop. He just thought he was kind of a bad salesman, kind of. Richard said a lot of incriminating things. Dom was really good at goading him into explaining how cyanide worked and the people he had killed with cyanide and other ways of killing people. So Richard really talked a lot, which for someone that didn't trust anybody, he really kind of spilled his guts with that, and later said that it was pretty much just because he planned on killing Dom. So it was like, it doesn't matter what I tell him. But still, that was really kind of out of character for Richard in the early days. And I think that was one of the parts in the book where you're just thinking, like, what is he thinking of like saying all this stuff? Because it's just like he completely forgot all of his training, for lack of a better word, and just started spilling.
Yeah, and that was one thing I really liked about the book in this part, is that they had a transcript basically in the book of their conversation, just back and forth, like a dialogue, like you were reading a script. And it was really interesting to see like exactly what the police transcript kind of said.
Yeah, because I think in the book there's a lot of embellishments with the conversations just because no one's going to remember an exact conversation. So they kind of set it up as, you know, the best they could, recreating the situation. But that one was like real, like the whole thing was real. So you really got to look at it. And yeah, definitely very interesting. So finally, Dom got Richard the cyanide, obviously not real. And Richard, being wary, tested it on a dog and nothing happened. So he got super pissed at Dom and realized that he was a liar. But by this time, it was pretty much too late for him. Police started surveilling the Kuklinski home, and Pat Kane even talked to Kuklinski once. He talked to Barbara once too, and kind of solidified Richard's hate for him. And eventually one day, Barbara and Richard headed out of the house and they were driving down the street and a bunch of cars started blocking the road. And initially Richard thought that a hit was being taken out on him. He didn't clock them as police cars at first. So he just thought someone was trying to take him out. But then he realized that they were police, and he had always said that he was going to go down in a blaze. He wasn't going to be taken, but they really caught him at a vulnerable time because Barbara was with him. He knew that if he started shooting at the police, they would shoot at him and she would probably be killed. So they really picked a good time to take him down in that way. So police ripped Richard and Barbara out of the car, and they really handled Barbara roughly. They arrested her, threw her to the ground, and Richard was so infuriated at that. He tried to get away from the cops so he could help her, but they eventually took him down. It took 8 of the strike force members to hold Richard down because, remember, he is super strong, and then at this point he's enraged, he has adrenaline, so I can't imagine what that scene looked like with 8 men having to hold him down. Once Richard was in jail, he realized that Solimene had sold him out, and I'm sure that was a very sobering moment for Richard because, like he said, he didn't trust many people, and that was one person that he pretty much trusted.
That was like his best friend, if you could say that.
So he actually called Solimene from prison and told him that he just got off Route 80 and was coming to see him, and Solimene got real scared and hung up and fled from the store because he thought that his number was up at that point.
Barbara was eventually released, and she was charged with the 25 auto that was found in the vehicle. It was actually Richard's, and they knew that it wasn't hers, but they were planning to use this charge on Barbara as a leverage against Richard. They also had caught Dwayne and some friends with marijuana. Even though the weed was not in Dwayne's possession, they still charged him with that just to have more leverage on Richard as well. Richard confessed to murdering Louis Masgay and Gary Maliband in order for the charges against Barbara and Dwayne to be dropped. Overall, Richard was charged with 19 felonies and 5 murders. He ended up in the same facility as his brother Joseph, so they were both serving life sentences, but Richard did not associate with Joseph at all. Which, if you remember, Joseph was his rapist, murderer brother. Richard knew that he was going to spend the rest of his life in jail, and he cried knowing that he was putting Barbara and his family through such a catastrophic event. He told Barbara that they should get a divorce so she can move on and be happy with her life. Richard then filed the divorce papers and legally separated from Barbara. Richard said that it was the hardest thing that he ever had to do, divorcing Barbara, and he continued to write letters to Barbara all the time, talking about how much he loved her and he missed her and how sorry he was about everything. Barbara barely responded to him, and she just kind of called him a monster for everything that he did. All of the stories about Richard Kuklinski really got him out in fame, I guess you could say. Oprah Winfrey contacted him and tried to put him on the show, but he refused. He also received a lot of love letters, but he didn't really care about them. He said that any woman who put nude pics of herself in an envelope to a stranger was just a pig. Richard also requested that Philip Carlo put at the end of the book that Richard said, quote, "I would rather be known as a nice man, not the Iceman," end quote. Richard ended up dying on March 5th, 2006. Some people believed that he was killed with poison rather than dying of natural causes. Dr. Michael Baden, which we've talked about him so much, he must be like a super big medical examiner. He ended up requesting a toxicology report to be conducted, and because Richard was saying that he was being poisoned and he was being murdered, he was slurring his words when he spoke. He even got to a point where he couldn't remember Barbara's number, which was a really big deal because obviously he loved Barbara and he tried to contact her all the time. Richard really believed that he was being killed. He told Barbara that they were trying to kill him and that if he didn't leave the hospital that he was murdered. And he also said that he didn't sign himself out of the hospital, unlike she was told, and he ended up telling Merrick the same thing. So it seemed like somebody signed him out other than himself, but also he was becoming forgetful, so it's kind of hard to decide. After doing an autopsy, it was determined that Richard Kuklinski died from a rare inflammation of his blood vessels.
I read an article about how Barbara's doing now. I think the article was from maybe 10 years ago or so, but it said that Barbara's living in a cabin in this secluded place in New Jersey, and that she lived with Merrick and her grandchildren. And she said that while she was with Richard, she could buy whatever she wanted and had this extravagant life. But she said now she has to pinch pennies to buy paper towels, but she's never been happier. And she said that Merrick still has Richard's ashes and keeps them in her room, and that Barbara won't even go into the room where his ashes were. That's how much she hated him. She said she was so relieved when he died, and that she has a much happier life now. So it's good that she was doing well at that point.
Overall, this book was definitely an interesting read for me. I love hearing about organized crime. So this book hooked me from the start. We both saw this book initially at CrimeCon. We went to a little presentation that used Richard Kuklinski as kind of an example as they talked about psychological terminology. And we thought it was just so interesting. So we went to the store and bought the book right there. And I'm so glad that I read it. I personally really liked the book. I thought the way Philip Carlo wrote everything was very well spoken. It kept you hooked. It seemed like a story, not just a biography. The only thing is that a lot of it was Richard Kuklinski's account of things, so it's kind of hard to know if he was telling the truth or not about certain stuff because you can't really back up some of the murders he claims he committed. Doing more research would maybe clarify some of that, but it would be interesting to know what really happened with everything. But I'm sure Philip Carlo did his research, you know?
I agree. I thought it was a really good book. I learned a lot about how organized crime worked. I didn't really know, I guess, much about that. You kind of, see it in movies and stuff, but the real aspects of it, I think, were explained, and that was pretty interesting. I think the writing was a little repetitive at times. I know there were a few instances where basically the same thing would be repeated, like almost word for word, 3 or 4 times throughout the book, and it was such a long book. I think some of that could have been cut, but that's kind of more of a stylistic thing.
I agree though, completely. I feel like if he cut out some of those repetitive things, it would have been like half the read.
Yeah. So, but it definitely kept me hooked the whole time. I did an audiobook, and I really liked with the audiobook that at the end there was the recordings of his interviews, so you could hear from his own words. And I think it was really interesting. Like you said, it was all of his account, so you don't really know what's real or not. And I know in the interviews at the end of the book, he would kind of go back on things he had said, or he'd be like, the interviewer would be like, oh, you said this, this, and this, and he'd be like, oh, I didn't say that, I wouldn't say that. Or he'd ask questions that he'd already answered, and he would be like, oh, I can't answer that at this time, like I don't remember, or things like that. So I think you got to kind of take it with a grain of salt, but at the same time, there was a lot of research done by a lot of people, and even, Pat Kane connected a lot of things. So there's like a lot of information out there.
And some of that stuff is just so specific,
Yeah. And Richard Kuklinski is just like not a very showboat kind of person. Like when we did the episode on Richard Cottingham, like he wanted to be known as this prolific serial killer. And so I think he had the personality where he would embellish things a lot, and it's like, oh, I killed like 100 people or whatever, but really it probably wasn't that much. He just really wanted to be known. But for Kuklinski, he was more just like, yep, like that's what I did as a job. That's it. Like,
yeah, and he was a lone wolf, so who did he care to flaunt to? He was just doing what he was supposed to do, making some money, and
yeah,
that was that.
And he was more proud of his ingenuity and kind of the science side of it and the puzzle of it more than he was just killing as many people as he could. Like that really wasn't his goal.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say, like, we don't support all of the bad stuff that he did at all. He was obviously an awful person with awful morals, but it's just so intriguing to look at the way his mind was working in different scenarios and how he was like a vigilante at one moment and a murderer at the other. It's just crazy.
Yeah, and just the image that he was this cold-blooded murderer who would just kill random people in the street just to experiment with stuff, or, you know, brutally mutilate people or feed them to rats. And then at the other hand, he would go to Disney World with his kids, and he would, you know, prance around like a little kid and ride rides and buy toys for the kids at the hospital and stuff like that. So it seemed like he had like a lot of personalities in there, but it was just him. Like it made sense to him, and he just did his thing, and it's pretty wild.
It makes you wonder if he's actually that unique, or if there's like a ton of Richard Kuklinskis out there that we just don't know about.
Yeah, that was one thing in the interview. I think the interviewer asked him something like, do you think there's a lot of people out there like you? And he was like, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised like that there are. And I think the interviewer said, like, do you think anyone could become a killer? And he was like, yeah. And he was like, do you think anyone could become a killer as a career? And he was like, no, that takes like a special kind of person. So just, it's very interesting. I know there's a lot of documentaries and interviews, and there's several other books about this too. So just hearing his own words and his own account and just the way he talks about it, I think really added something to it. I think that was very, very interesting.
And might I say, if you haven't heard him talk, he sounds exactly what you would imagine a mafia member sounds like. Exactly.
Yeah, he has the like accent and everything, but he's also very soft spoken. Like you would expect, or I expected at least, someone as like big of stature and like, I don't know, something more gruff, I guess, something, but he's fairly soft spoken, and
like
just
motorbike taxi in the bar.
But he's kind of just a soft spoken, like normal sounding guy.
So that kind of brings us to the conclusion of our episode today. We hope that you guys liked reading The Iceman. We know it was a little vulgar and graphic in some parts of it, but overall it's just such an interesting book, and we really enjoyed it. So we hope that you did as well. If you have any opinions about it, please reach out to us right on our Facebook page. Start a discussion with people. We want everyone to be able to talk to one another, so please reach out. Let us know what you thought. Our next month's book is going to be Find Her by Lisa Gardner, and it'll come out on September 4th, 2020. So go ahead, put in your orders. You can go on our website, theabysspod.com. We're going to have a page up for the Iceman, and at the bottom of that, you'll be able to click a link that'll take you to buy this book. Go get it. It's really good. You're going to really like it, and we are super excited to talk to you about it. Please send us some messages if you have any thoughts about it. It's going to be a good one to talk about. So here is the summary from Amazon, just to give you guys a little taste of it if you've never heard of this book. 7 years ago, carefree college student Flora Dane was kidnapped while on spring break. For 472 days, Flora learned just how much one person can endure. Miraculously alive after her ordeal, Flora has spent the past 5 years reacquainting herself with the rhythms of normal life, working with her FBI victim advocate Samuel Keynes. She has a mother who's never stopped loving her, a brother who is scared of the person she's become, and a bedroom wall covered with photos of other girls who've never made it home. When Boston detective Dee Dee Warren is called to the scene of a crime, a dead man and a bound naked woman who killed him, she learns that Flora has tangled with 3 other suspects since her return to society. Is Flora a victim or a vigilante? And with her first-hand knowledge of criminal behavior, could she hold the key to rescuing a missing college student whose abduction has rocked Boston? When Flora herself disappears, Dee Dee realizes a far more sinister predator is out there. One who's determined that this time, Flora Dane will never escape. And now it is all up to Dee Dee Warren to find her.
Definitely check that book out. It's really, really good. And that pretty much wraps up our episode for today. We will catch you next time. Thanks for jumping into the abyss with us.
See ya!